It was February 1963, and more than 50,000 fans packed into the Speedway, expecting another chapter in America's biggest racing war. Ford had arrived with confidence. Chrysler had come armed with raw horsepower. Chevrolet? Officially, Chevrolet wasn't even supposed to be there. Just months earlier, General Motors had publicly withdrawn from factory-backed racing. The company promised shareholders and the public it was done chasing trophies. No more secret race cars. No more engineering arms race. But behind locked doors, hidden inside engineering buildings, where even many GM employees weren't allowed, another story was unfolding. A handful of engineers had been handed one mission: build an engine so powerful, so advanced, that Ford would never see it coming. Most people have no idea this engine even existed. It didn't wear flashy badges. It wasn't advertised in magazines. Very few photographs were taken while it was being developed. Inside Chevrolet, it had a nickname that sounded more like a government weapons program than an automobile engine: the Mystery Motor. And what happened next changed American performance forever. To understand why Chevrolet was willing to risk everything, you have to go back to the early 1960s. Detroit wasn't just selling cars anymore. It was fighting a war. Every Sunday, millions of Americans watched NASCAR, and whatever won on Sunday usually sold on Monday. Victory at Daytona or Charlotte translated directly into customers walking into dealerships. Ford understood that better than anyone. Its new high-performance FE Series V8s were becoming increasingly dominant. The 406 cubic inch engines were making serious power, and Ford engineers were already planning something even bigger. Chevrolet couldn't afford to fall behind. The small block V8 had become a legend since its debut in 1955. But NASCAR was changing. Cars were getting heavier, tracks were getting faster. Speeds were climbing toward 170 miles per hour on the high banks of Daytona. The little 283 and 327 cubic inch engines were reaching their limits. Chevrolet needed something completely different, not an improved small block, an entirely new weapon. But there was a problem. In June 1957, the Automobile Manufacturers Association had pushed manufacturers to officially withdraw from organized racing. General Motors agreed, at least on paper. Officially, Chevrolet had left racing. Unofficially, engineers simply stopped talking about it. Development moved underground. Projects were hidden under innocent code names. Budgets were disguised. Testing became incredibly secretive. Only trusted engineers and executives knew exactly what was happening. Among them were legendary Chevrolet engineers who believed one thing above all else: if Ford was building bigger engines, Chevrolet would build a smarter one. That decision gave birth to one of the most mysterious engines in American history. Unlike the famous Mark IV big block that enthusiasts know today, this was something few outsiders had ever seen. Internally, engineers called it the Mark II. The architecture looked unfamiliar. Instead of borrowing heavily from the existing small block, nearly everything was redesigned. The combustion chambers were radically different. The valve angles were optimized for airflow. Massive ports allowed incredible breathing at high RPM, while the deep skirt block offered far greater rigidity than previous Chevrolet V8s. It looked strange. It sounded even stranger. And that's exactly what Chevrolet wanted, because confusion was part of the strategy. Then came the numbers. The displacement measured 427 cubic inches, or nearly 7 liters. Engineers achieved it with a bore of approximately 4.84 inches and a stroke of 3.65 inches, creating an extremely over-square design that encouraged high engine speeds. Compression ratios varied depending on race configuration, generally sitting around 12:1. On paper, official horsepower estimates hovered around 430 horsepower. Nobody believed those numbers. With careful tuning, larger carburetors, aggressive camshafts, and open exhaust headers, insiders estimated the mystery motor was comfortably producing well over 500 horsepower. Some whispered figures closer to 550. But massive power always creates massive problems. The first prototypes looked promising on the dyno. Then components started failing. Valve springs couldn't always control the heavy valvetrain at sustained racing RPM. Pushrods flexed under enormous loads. Oil temperatures climbed relentlessly during long endurance testing. The engine wasn't weak. It was simply asking more from every component than American V8s had ever demanded before. The engineering team refused to back down. Stronger valve springs appeared. Revised rocker geometry improved stability. Cooling passages inside the heads were refined to reduce hot spots around the exhaust valves. Every improvement brought another test. Every test uncovered another lesson. And slowly, the engine became something terrifying. By late 1962, select NASCAR teams began hearing whispers. Chevrolet had something new. Nobody knew exactly what. One rumor claimed it was a lightweight aluminum engine. Another insisted it had overhead camshafts. Some believed Chevrolet had secretly copied European racing technology. None of those stories were true. Reality was almost more unbelievable. Chevrolet had simply built one of the largest, most sophisticated pushrod V8s America had ever seen. Then the real secret operation began. Instead of announcing the engine with advertisements or flashy press conferences, Chevrolet quietly distributed a limited number of engines to trusted racing organizations. Among the people connected with testing was legendary mechanic and crew chief Smokey Yunick, whose reputation for finding speed bordered on mythical. When Smokey looked at the mystery motor, he immediately recognized its potential. The airflow through those enormous cylinder heads was unlike anything Chevrolet had previously produced. The engine wanted RPM. It wanted long straights. It wanted Daytona. Still, there was no guarantee it would survive. Building horsepower inside a laboratory was one thing. Holding together for 500 brutal miles at full throttle was something else entirely. The stage was finally set. Hidden transport trucks rolled toward Daytona, carrying engines few people had ever seen. Ford engineers noticed unfamiliar valve covers. Mechanics spotted strange intake manifolds. Rumors exploded through the garages, and when those mysterious V8s finally roared to life, the sound alone told Ford this wasn't just another Chevrolet engine. It was the beginning of a whole new war. The first time the mystery motor thundered through the Daytona garage area, conversations stopped. Veteran mechanics looked up from their toolboxes, crew chiefs abandoned setup sheets, even rival engineers drifted closer, pretending to inspect another car while trying to catch a glimpse beneath the hood. Ford certainly hadn't expected this. The Blue Oval had spent years refining its FE Series V8s. Ford's philosophy was straightforward: build enormous torque, make the engine nearly indestructible, and let NASCAR's long straights do the rest. Chevrolet had chosen a different path. Instead of simply chasing displacement, its engineers obsessed over airflow. The mystery motor's cylinder heads featured huge, nearly symmetrical intake ports and canted valves that allowed the engine to breathe far better than earlier Chevrolet V8s. Rather than forcing air to make sharp turns inside the head, the intake charge flowed in a much straighter path toward the combustion chambers. That meant more oxygen. More oxygen meant more fuel, and more fuel meant power. Lots of it. The mystery motor used a forged steel crankshaft capable of surviving sustained high RPM, forged connecting rods, lightweight racing pistons, and aggressive solid lifter camshafts. Dual 4-barrel carburetors sat on top of a high-rise aluminum intake manifold, feeding enough fuel to satisfy nearly 7 liters of hungry displacement. Race versions comfortably exceeded 500 horsepower. Torque approached the 480 to 500 pound-foot range. For 1963, those numbers bordered on unbelievable. But there was a problem. Power meant nothing if the engine couldn't finish the race. During endurance testing, engineers kept finding the same ugly evidence: scuffed pistons, tiny metallic flakes trapped inside the oil filter. One mechanic later described draining the oil after a long test session and seeing it shimmer like silver paint. That wasn't lubricant. That was the engine slowly grinding itself apart. The biggest enemy wasn't horsepower, it was heat. At over 6,500 revolutions per minute, for lap after lap, temperatures skyrocketed. Exhaust valves glowed red. Oil viscosity dropped. Every bearing inside the block was being asked to survive forces that ordinary production engines would never experience. The engineering team attacked each problem one at a time. Valve spring metallurgy improved. Oil passages were revised to provide more consistent lubrication. Cooling around the combustion chambers received additional attention to reduce localized hotspots. It wasn't glamorous work. No newspaper reported redesigned oil galleries. But those invisible improvements kept engines alive, and that was the difference between a legend and a disaster. Then came Daytona. The 1963 Daytona Speed Weeks became the Mystery Motor's first public battlefield. Chevrolet-backed teams quietly rolled their cars onto pit road, careful not to reveal too much before qualifying. Ford teams immediately noticed something unusual. The engines sat differently. The valve covers looked unfamiliar. Even the exhaust note carried a sharper, deeper bark. When qualifying began, the mystery motor immediately showed why so much effort had gone into its development. Acceleration out of the corners was brutally strong. Down Daytona's banking, the engine pulled harder and harder as RPM climbed, refusing to run out of breath where older engines began to fade. Drivers described the power delivery as relentless. One reportedly said it felt like the engine just kept pulling long after you expected it to quit. But race day is cruel. Dyno sheets don't matter. Only the checkered flag matters. The mystery motor had astonishing speed. Reliability remained its biggest question mark. Several teams experienced mechanical concerns throughout speed weeks. Valve train issues continued appearing under sustained race conditions, and keeping the engines perfectly tuned proved difficult. The engine demanded precision. Tiny tuning mistakes became expensive failures. Although the mystery motor demonstrated remarkable performance, it never achieved the overwhelming domination many inside Chevrolet had imagined. It was fast, exceptionally fast, but racing rewards complete packages, not isolated brilliance. Ford continued pushing harder. Its own 427 FE program rapidly matured, producing increasingly reliable and competitive engines that could survive NASCAR's brutal schedule. Inside Chevrolet, engineers reached a difficult conclusion. The mystery motor had proven something incredibly valuable, not that it should become a production engine, but that its engineering philosophy worked. The cylinder head design, the breathing characteristics, the block architecture, those ideas deserved another chance, just not in their current form. So while race fans focused on Ford versus Chevrolet every weekend, something even bigger was happening inside GM engineering offices. The mystery motor wasn't approaching its greatest victory. It was approaching its own execution. Engineers quietly began developing an entirely new big block family. Lessons learned from every cracked component, every overheated valve, every oil pressure fluctuation, and every successful lap were carefully documented. The mystery motor had become a rolling laboratory, a very expensive laboratory. General Motors never intended to build thousands of them. Only a relatively small number of complete engines were assembled, primarily for competition and engineering evaluation. Today, surviving originals are extraordinarily rare, making them some of the most mysterious and valuable Chevrolet racing engines ever created. Because before the public truly understood what the mystery motor was, Chevrolet had already moved on. Its replacement was about to become one of the greatest big block V8 families in automotive history. The replacement arrived so quietly that most people never realized they were witnessing the end of one era and the beginning of another. Inside Chevrolet engineering, the mystery motor had already served its purpose. It had answered the questions nobody could solve on paper. How much airflow was enough? How far could a pushrod V8 be pushed before reliability collapsed? Could Chevrolet build a big block capable of standing toe-to-toe with Ford's best? The answer was yes, but not with the engines sitting in front of them. The engineers went back to work. Every cracked rocker arm, every bearing that showed unusual wear became part of a growing mountain of engineering data. Instead of trying to save the mystery motor, Chevrolet decided to build something even better. The result became the Mark IV Big Block. Introduced for the 1965 model year with the famous 396 cubic inch V8, the Mark IV looked completely different, but its DNA traced directly back to the secret program that had begun only a few years earlier. The new engine featured revised canted valve cylinder heads that dramatically improved breathing while simplifying production. Engineers redesigned the water jackets for more consistent cooling and strengthened the block to handle enormous cylinder pressures. Chevrolet had transformed an experimental racing weapon into a practical performance engine, and that changed everything. Soon, the 396 was followed by the legendary 427. Then came the monstrous 454. The same engineering philosophy that had once lived inside the mystery motor suddenly powered Corvettes, Chevelles, Camaros, Novas, and countless drag cars across America. The secret engine was gone. Its descendants were everywhere. The horsepower war wasn't slowing down. Ford answered with increasingly powerful versions of its FE Series 427. Chevrolet responded with the L72 427. Officially rated at 425 horsepower, but widely believed to produce far more. The all-aluminum ZL1 pushed the envelope even further. The mystery motor had helped ignite that explosion. Ironically, almost nobody outside Chevrolet knew it, but then another enemy arrived that couldn't be beaten with horsepower. Government regulations, new emission standards, tightening safety regulations, and the shift toward unleaded gasoline forced manufacturers to rethink high-compression engines. Insurance companies made matters even worse. By the early 1970s, a young buyer trying to insure a 425-horsepower muscle car could face premiums that rivaled monthly car payments. Then came the 1973 oil crisis. Fuel prices climbed, long lines formed at gas stations. Consumers who once dreamed of 7-liter V8s suddenly wanted fuel economy. The golden age of factory racing and giant naturally aspirated engines slowly faded into history. By then, the mystery motor had already become little more than a forgotten chapter inside Chevrolet's archives. There was no farewell ceremony, no museum display, it simply disappeared. Many prototype engines were dismantled after testing. Others lived hard lives in competition before being retired. A handful survived in private collections, hidden away in garages and museums where only the most dedicated historians truly understood what they were looking at. Today, authentic mystery motors are among the rarest Chevrolet racing engines ever built. Their value isn't measured only in dollars, it's measured in influence. Walk through any major collector car auction and you'll see legendary Chevrolet big blocks selling for extraordinary prices. Rare L88 Corvettes routinely command well into 7 figures. Genuine ZL1 Camaros are among the most valuable American muscle cars ever produced. None of those engines would exist in quite the same form without the lessons learned from Chevrolet's secret experiment. The mystery motor didn't fail. It graduated. It wasn't buried because it was a disaster. It disappeared because it had already accomplished its mission. It proved Chevrolet could build a racing engine capable of challenging Ford's dominance. More importantly, it gave engineers the blueprint for an entire generation of big block V8s that would define American performance for decades. Sometimes history remembers the heroes. Sometimes it remembers the winners, but almost never does it remember the prototype that made the victory possible. Even today, if you mention Chevrolet's greatest engines, most enthusiasts immediately think of the 409, the 427, the L88, the LS6 454, or the all-aluminum ZL1. Very few mention the mystery motor, not because it wasn't important, because it was never supposed to be famous. Its job wasn't to sell cars, its job was to solve problems, to take risks, to fail, to teach, and then quietly step aside so something greater could take its place. That's why its story feels almost unbelievable. A secret engine developed behind closed doors during one of the fiercest rivalries in American motorsport appeared just long enough to make Ford pay attention before vanishing almost as quickly as it had arrived. Not every legend leaves behind trophies, some leave behind blueprints. And in many ways, that's exactly what the mystery motor did. It laid the foundation for one of the most successful families of high-performance V8s America has ever produced. More than 60 years later, enthusiasts still search for surviving examples. Restorers still debate the smallest casting details. Historians still uncover forgotten photographs and engineering documents that reveal just how ambitious the project really was. For an engine that was never meant to become famous, it has achieved something even rarer: immortality through mystery. And maybe that's the greatest irony of all. The V8 GM, built in secret to challenge Ford, wasn't erased from history. It became the hidden chapter that made history possible,